In September 1939, as German tanks rolled into Poland and Europe descended into war, the United States Army stood dangerously unprepared. Its officer corps was bloated, aging, and shaped by seniority, not competence. Promotions were earned by time served, not by the ability to fight and win a modern war. At the center of this fragile institution stood General George Catlett Marshall, newly appointed U.S. Army Chief of Staff on September 1, 1939, the very day World War II began in Europe. Marshall did not wait for disaster to expose weakness. He made a decision almost no senior military leader had ever dared to make before war began. He would remove generals, many respected, many well-connected, some even friends, because he believed they would fail under combat pressure. It was not political. It was not personal. It was, in Marshall's words, duty. By 1941, over 600 senior officers would be quietly pushed aside. This decision would shape every American battlefield, from North Africa to Normandy, from Guadalcanal to Germany, and it would determine whether the U.S. Army survived its first true test of modern war.
Between the two world wars, the United States Army shrank into a force designed more for administration than combat. By 1939, it ranked 17th in size globally, behind nations like Portugal. Promotion was governed by rigid seniority rules. Officers advanced because they endured, not because they excelled. Physical fitness standards were lax. Many senior commanders had never led troops under fire. Training emphasized drills and inspections, not rapid maneuver, combined arms, or modern mechanized warfare. Marshall understood this system intimately. As a young officer in the Philippines, he had already stood out for his intensity and professionalism. In one fitness report, a question asked whether the reporting officer would want Marshall serving under him in wartime. The reply was blunt: "I would prefer to be serving under him." That endorsement, written years before Marshall's rise, reflected the quality he now demanded across the Army. The problem was clear. An army trained for peace would collapse in war. Marshall believed waiting for failure would cost tens of thousands of lives.
On September 1, 1939, President Franklin D. Roosevelt appointed George C. Marshall as Chief of Staff of the United States Army. Marshall had never commanded troops in combat, but he had something rarer: a precise understanding of organizational failure. He rejected the idea that rank entitled an officer to command. To Marshall, leadership was not inherited, it was proven. Within months, he began quietly relieving senior generals, often without public explanation. There were no trials, no humiliation, simply reassignment or retirement. Some officers were removed for poor physical condition, others for rigid thinking, many because they could not adapt. Marshall's standard was uncompromising. Could this officer command men under fire? If the answer was uncertain, the decision was final. West Point graduates initially resented him. Marshall was VMI, not West Point. Yet Marshall came to deeply respect West Pointers for their discipline and athletic leadership. At Michie Stadium, a plaque still bears his words: "I need an officer for a dangerous mission. I want a West Point football player." It captured what Marshall valued most: character under pressure. Historians would later debate the word purge, but the controversy was never about terminology, it was about timing. Marshall acted before defeat forced reform. Most armies only learn after catastrophe. France learned in 1940. The Soviet Union learned in 1941. Marshall refused to let the United States learn that way. By 1941, he had replaced or retired hundreds of senior officers. Some were old friends. One was even a former cadet contemporary, relieved after delaying a critical assignment because he was supervising the shipment of his furniture. Marshall's response was immediate. The general was removed on the spot. Yet the system was not perfect. One man, General Lloyd Fredendall, slipped through. Fredendall projected confidence and spoke the language Marshall valued. But in February 1943, at Kasserine Pass, his failures became clear. His headquarters sat far behind the front, deep in a bunker built for his comfort. The result was disaster. After replacing him, General George Patton would later say, "I cannot see what Fredendall did to justify his existence." Even Marshall's purge could not catch every flaw, but without it, the U.S. Army might never have survived its first battles.
Removing ineffective leaders was only half of Marshall's strategy. The other half was far more consequential, identifying and elevating talent early. Marshall actively searched for officers who demonstrated calm under pressure, clarity of thought, and a willingness to learn. He favored men who trained relentlessly, listened carefully, and accepted responsibility without excuse. One of those men was a relatively obscure colonel named Dwight David Eisenhower. In 1940, Eisenhower had never led troops in combat, but Marshall noticed something others missed: his ability to plan, coordinate, and communicate across complex organizations. Marshall brought Eisenhower to Washington, placing him in the War Plans Division. Within months, Eisenhower was drafting contingency plans for a global war. This was not favoritism, it was deliberate preparation. Marshall believed future generals had to think beyond regiments and divisions. They had to manage alliances, logistics, and entire theaters of war. By promoting officers for capacity, not resume, Marshall created a leadership pipeline ready for a conflict that would span continents. It was an unglamorous revolution, but one that would soon be tested in blood. After Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, Marshall's gamble moved from theory to reality. The U.S. Army expanded at a pace unmatched in its history, growing from 190,000 men to over 8 million in less than 4 years. Training camps multiplied across the country. Entire divisions were formed from civilians with no military background. The question was no longer whether Marshall's purge was controversial. The question was whether it had been enough. Marshall refused to micromanage combat commanders. Instead, he judged them ruthlessly by results. Those who adapted stayed. Those who failed were removed, quickly and quietly. This system shocked allies and unsettled politicians, but it created a command culture where excuses carried no weight. Marshall himself remained in Washington, resisting pressure to take a field command. He believed his duty was not personal glory, but institutional survival. By 1942, the U.S. Army was learning painful lessons, but it was learning fast, and that speed mattered.
The U.S. Army's first major test came in North Africa, 1942. Operation Torch placed inexperienced American forces against veteran German units. The results were mixed, and at Kasserine Pass, deeply troubling.
German forces under Erwin Rommel exploited poor coordination, weak leadership, and confused command structures. American units broke and retreated. At the center of the failure stood General Lloyd Fredendall. The officer Marshall had misjudged. Fredendall commanded from far behind the front, issuing vague orders and isolating himself from subordinates. His leadership style reflected everything Marshall feared about peacetime generals. The response was swift. Marshall backed Eisenhower's decision to remove Fredendall and replace him with George S. Patton, whose insistence on discipline and presence at the front restored confidence. This moment mattered. It demonstrated that Marshall's system, even when imperfect, corrected itself. Failure was not tolerated. Adaptation was mandatory. The purge was no longer theoretical. It was operational.
George Marshall never commanded troops in battle during World War II. Yet no American general exerted greater influence on how the war was fought. He selected commanders. He shaped doctrine. He enforced standards. Marshall insisted that leadership was earned daily, not granted permanently. When President Roosevelt considered appointing Marshall as Supreme Allied Commander, Marshall refused to lobby for himself. Roosevelt later said Marshall was the only man he knew who could be trusted not to seek power. That restraint mattered. Marshall remained in Washington, coordinating the largest military expansion in history, while ensuring that those sent into combat were led by men capable of learning, adapting, and enduring. The results were visible by 1944. An army that could fight across oceans, sustain massive operations, and recover from setbacks without collapse. Others would receive battlefield fame. Others would accept surrender ceremonies. But without Marshall's purge, without his willingness to remove the comfortable and elevate the capable, the U.S. Army might never have reached that point at all. By 1943, Marshall faced his most consequential responsibility yet, selecting the commanders who would lead the Allied invasion of Western Europe. Operation Overlord would require more than battlefield courage. It demanded patience, diplomacy, and logistical mastery on an unprecedented scale. Marshall had already shaped the leadership pool. Now he had to trust it. He supported Dwight D. Eisenhower as Supreme Allied Commander, not because Eisenhower was the most aggressive general, but because he could manage coalition warfare. British, American, Canadian, and Free French forces would fight under one command. Personal rivalries and national pride threatened unity as much as German defenses. Marshall believed the invasion's success depended on commanders who could absorb pressure without cracking. This was the ultimate test of his purge. The men chosen were not perfect, but they were adaptable. And adaptability, Marshall believed, would decide the war. Many assumed George Marshall would command the invasion himself. President Roosevelt seriously considered appointing him Supreme Allied Commander, but Marshall never sought the role. When Roosevelt asked if he wanted the position, Marshall answered that he would serve wherever ordered and said nothing more. That response settled the matter. Roosevelt later explained that Marshall was too valuable in Washington to lose. No one else could coordinate production, manpower, strategy, and alliance politics at the scale required. Marshall understood this instinctively. He believed leadership meant placing the mission above personal ambition. By staying behind, Marshall ensured continuity. Commanders in the field could be replaced if necessary, but the system guiding them could not. His influence was not visible on the beaches of Normandy, but it was present in every decision that made that landing possible. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy. The operation was vast, complex, and fragile. Weather delays, airborne dispersal, and fierce German resistance threatened collapse, particularly at Omaha Beach. Yet the command structure held. Local commanders adjusted plans without waiting for distant approval. Junior officers took initiative when communications failed. This was not accidental. Marshall had demanded leaders who could function independently, who understood intent rather than rigid orders. The purge of peacetime generals had removed those dependent on formality and hierarchy. In their place stood officers trained to think. Normandy did not succeed because it was flawless. It succeeded because the leadership could adapt under fire. That adaptability traced directly back to decisions made years earlier, long before a single soldier stepped onto French soil.
World War II confirmed what Marshall had believed all along. Seniority did not win wars. Competence did. The U.S. Army learned faster than its enemies. Commanders were replaced when necessary, without scandal or delay. This flexibility stood in sharp contrast to systems that clung to rank and tradition at the cost of effectiveness. Marshall's reforms reshaped not only who led the Army, but how leadership itself was defined. The cost of error was real. Mistakes were made. Lives were lost. But the institutional collapse that had haunted other armies never came. By the war's end, many historians would argue that the most important American general of World War II was not Eisenhower, Patton, or MacArthur. It was the man who ensured the right leaders were in place before the first shots were fired. George C. Marshall.
George Marshall's approach to leadership stood in sharp contrast to some of the most famous battlefield commanders of the war. Generals like Douglas MacArthur embodied personal authority and dramatic presence. Marshall embodied restraint. He discouraged self-promotion. He avoided public criticism. And he refused to tolerate excuses, especially from senior officers. Marshall believed that armies failed not from lack of bravery, but from poor systems and weak leadership discipline. This belief shaped how he evaluated commanders late into the war. Victory did not protect officers from scrutiny. Those who succeeded once were expected to succeed again, or step aside. This standard created tension, but it preserved effectiveness. Marshall's army was not built around personalities. It was built around performance.
By 1944, the difference between the U.S. Army and its enemies was no longer equipment or manpower. It was adaptability. American commanders revised tactics quickly. After-action reports were studied and acted upon. Mistakes were documented rather than hidden. Marshall insisted that failures be treated as lessons, not liabilities. This philosophy allowed the Army to improve continuously, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes. German command structures, by contrast, grew increasingly rigid. Officers were often retained for loyalty rather than effectiveness. Marshall had anticipated this contrast years earlier. His purge had removed those unwilling or unable to learn. What remained was an institution capable of evolving faster than the battlefield itself.
In December 1944, the German army launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. Once again, American forces were caught by surprise. But unlike earlier failures, the command system did not fracture. Units regrouped. Commanders coordinated rapidly. Replacements were decisive. Marshall supported these decisions without hesitation. The Army bent, but it did not break. This resilience reflected years of leadership selection focused on judgment under pressure. The purge had not created perfect generals, it had created reliable ones, and reliability in war often mattered more than brilliance.
Even in the final months of the war, Marshall continued to enforce accountability. Commanders who stalled unnecessarily were questioned. Those who failed to coordinate effectively were replaced. Victory did not suspend standards. This approach prevented complacency at a critical moment. The war was nearly won, but Marshall refused to assume success was inevitable. He understood that wars are often lost in their final phases, not by defeat, but by carelessness. His insistence on competence until the end ensured that momentum was maintained across all theaters. It was an unpopular discipline, but a necessary one.
When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the U.S. Army had become the most effective force in its history. But Marshall did not celebrate victory as validation of himself. He saw it as confirmation of a principle, that institutions mattered more than individuals. The army he helped build would not vanish with the war's end. Its leadership philosophy would shape future generations. Marshall had proven that reform did not require defeat, only foresight. Few military leaders had ever reshaped an army before catastrophe forced change. Marshall had done it quietly, deliberately, and at enormous personal cost.
George Marshall never commanded troops in combat. He never accepted a victory parade. Yet his influence extended from the first mobilization order to the final surrender. His standard was simple and unyielding: duty, duty, duty. That standard guided his decisions, even when they were unpopular. It guided his refusal to seek power. It guided his willingness to remove friends for the sake of effectiveness. Marshall believed leadership was not about being admired, but about being responsible. This belief defined the Army's conduct in World War II.
The lesson of Marshall's purge extends beyond World War II. It addresses a timeless problem: how organizations distinguish experience from competence. Marshall understood that length of service did not guarantee ability, and that waiting for failure was the most expensive way to learn. His reforms saved lives, not by avoiding mistakes, but by limiting how long mistakes were allowed to continue. The free world benefited from that foresight, not because Marshall was infallible, but because he acted before inflexibility became fatal. That may be his greatest legacy.
After the war, the scale of what had been accomplished became clear. The United States Army had expanded, fought across multiple continents, and then demobilized without collapsing into disorder. This outcome was not automatic. Many wartime armies struggled to return to peace. Marshall's emphasis on discipline and institutional continuity eased that transition. Officers who had proven capable were retained. Those who had not quietly stepped aside. The purge had not been an act of destruction. It had been an act of preparation. Only after victory could its full effect be measured.
In 1947, President Harry S. Truman asked George Marshall to take on a new mission, this time without a uniform. As Secretary of State, Marshall confronted a devastated Europe. Once again, he applied the same principles that had guided his military reforms: preparation over reaction, structure over improvisation, competence over politics. The European Recovery Program, soon known as the Marshall Plan, reflected this mindset. It was not charity, it was stabilization, designed to prevent the conditions that had led to war. Marshall's influence now extended beyond armies to nations.
The same traits that defined Marshall's wartime leadership defined his diplomacy. He spoke plainly,
He avoided ideology. He focused on outcomes. Just as he had replaced generals who could not adapt, he sought to rebuild economies before instability took hold. This continuity mattered. Marshall's career demonstrated that leadership principles were transferable across institutions, across crises. Whether managing armies or alliances, his method remained unchanged.
Marshall's decisions were not beyond criticism. Some argued that the purge removed officers who might have adapted given time. Others pointed to figures like Lloyd Fredendall as proof that judgment could fail. Marshall accepted these criticisms without defensiveness. He never claimed infallibility. His argument was narrower and more compelling, that delay was more dangerous than error. In war, mistakes could be corrected. Unwillingness to act could not.
Historians continue to debate Marshall's purge, but few dispute its impact. The U.S. Army entered World War II inexperienced and emerged capable, resilient, and adaptable. That transformation began before the war was fought. Marshall's decision to remove peacetime leaders before catastrophe struck remains rare in military history. It is studied not because it was dramatic, but because it worked.
World War II produced many famous commanders, but influence is not measured only on the battlefield. Without Marshall, Eisenhower may never have risen. Without Marshall, failures like Kasserine might have repeated. Without Marshall, reform may have come too late. His power lay in selection, discipline, and foresight. That may be why many historians argue that the most important American general of World War II was not the one who accepted surrender, but the one who ensured the right people were present to receive it.
George Catlett Marshall reshaped the U.S. Army not through charisma or combat, but through judgment. He acted before defeat forced change. He valued competence over entitlement, and he understood that leadership was responsibility, not reward. The purge of 1939 was not about removing men. It was about preparing an institution. That preparation helped win a war and stabilized a world afterward. Marshall's legacy endures not because he sought greatness, but because he understood what duty demanded.
George C. Marshall never sought applause. He believed history was best served by quiet competence and by doing what duty required, even when it was unpopular. If you value documentaries that focus on evidence, context, and the difficult decisions that shape history, consider subscribing to this channel. Each video is carefully researched to preserve the complexity of the past, without distortion, exaggeration, or shortcuts. Thank you for watching and for helping keep serious history alive.